The letter arrived in Jonas Lockhart's hands on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1874, pressed into his palm by a man who had fewer than 3 hours left to live, and it changed the entire direction of his life before the ink had even dried from the tears that had fallen onto it. Jonas had been working the cattle drives out of Abilene, Kansas, for the better part of 4 years by then. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that hard outdoor living made a man lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that had seen enough of the world to make him quiet in the company of strangers. He was not an unhappy man, but he was a solitary one, and most of the other hands on the drive respected that about him. He did his work well, he kept his word, and he never started trouble. That was enough out here. The dying man's name was Chester Albright. Jonas had found him 3 miles off the main trail near a dry creek bed, his horse long gone, his leg broken and badly infected from a fall he must have taken 2 days prior. Jonas had gone to the creek to check the water before the herd needed it and found Chester lying against a cottonwood, barely conscious, his lips cracked white with thirst. Jonas had given him water from his canteen. He had built a small fire because the nights were still cold even in early May, and he had stayed with the man through the afternoon and into the evening, keeping him comfortable the way he would want someone to keep him comfortable if the roles had ever been reversed. Chester had spoken in fragments at first, delirious with fever and pain, but as the sun dropped lower and his body seemed to accept what was coming, he grew clearer. He grew purposeful. "My coat," Chester had said. "Inside pocket." The letter, Jonas had found it. A single folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from what looked like months of handling, as though it had been read and refolded many times before Chester had finally decided to carry it somewhere. "I need you to deliver it," Chester said. "I need you to find her and give it to her yourself. Not mail it. You hear me? Not mail it. You give it to her yourself and you tell her what it says if she cannot read it herself. You promise me that." Jonas had looked at the man carefully. "Who is she?" Chester's hand closed around Jonas's wrist with a strength that seemed impossible given the rest of him. "Her name is Mabel Norris. She is in Calhoun Creek. That is a town in the Texas Panhandle, south end of the Llano Estacado. Her father was Thomas Norris, who was my friend for 22 years, and he died last autumn, and she does not know what she meant to him. She does not know because Thomas was the kind of man who never said the things that mattered most until it was too late, and then it was too late." Jonas held the letter. It was sealed with a plain wax stamp that had been pressed flat long ago, the kind of seal a man made without ceremony, without elegance, just because he needed to close something and keep it closed. "You read it?" Jonas asked. "I wrote it," Chester said quietly. "Thomas told me what to write before the consumption took his voice entirely. He told me every word. It was the last useful thing I ever did for him. Chester Albright died before midnight. Jonas buried him as well as he could with the tools he had, marked the grave with a flat stone that he scratched a CA onto with the tip of his knife, and rode back to camp. He told the trail boss he had a personal matter to attend to. The trail boss, a broad man named Garrett who had known Jonas long enough not to ask unnecessary questions, told him he would hold his pay until Jonas came back or not, whichever it turned out to be. Jonas packed what he needed, tucked the letter into the inside breast pocket of his coat exactly where Chester had carried it, and started riding south. 300 miles between Abilene and the Texas Panhandle in 1874 was not a small thing. The railroad did not reach everywhere yet, and the land between was as unforgiving as any stretch of earth Jonas had ever crossed. He rode through the wide, open grass country, where the wind came unbroken across the plains, and pushed so hard against a man that it felt personal, like the land itself was trying to hold him back. He crossed shallow rivers swollen with snowmelt, picked his way around the mud flats that spread out from their banks, and camped in the open on the nights when there was no settlement close enough to reach by dark. He stopped twice in small towns to rest his horse, a steady roan gelding named Cooper that he had owned for 3 years and trusted without reservation. In a place called Mead, he bought supplies. In a place barely worth naming, just a trading post and a livery, and a row of 3 buildings that might generously be called a street, he asked a man at the counter if he had ever heard of Calhoun Creek. The man had. He said it was a cattle and farming town, maybe 800 people if you counted the outlying ranches, settled mostly by families who had come out of East Texas after the war. He said it had a church and a general store and a doctor, and that people seemed to mostly get along there, which out here in 1874 was said about a town the way you might say a horse was sound in both legs. It was the most important thing. Jonas thanked him and kept riding. He arrived in Calhoun Creek on a Thursday afternoon, 14 days after leaving Abilene. His coat was dusty, his jaw was rough with 2 weeks of beard, and he was hungry in the bone-deep way that comes from days of short rations and long miles. Cooper was tired but holding, and Jonas walked him slow into town the way a man walks a horse he respects. Calhoun Creek was a main street of packed dirt with wooden boardwalks on both sides, a row of false-fronted buildings, horses at the hitching rails, and the sound of a hammer somewhere down past the livery where something new was being built. It smelled like wood smoke and horses and the dry sweetness of cut lumber, and it felt alive in the modest, purposeful way that frontier towns felt alive when they were working and not waiting. Jonas dismounted at the livery and paid for Cooper to be stabled and fed. He asked the livery boy, a young fellow of maybe 15 with a serious expression, if he knew of a woman named Mabel Norris. The boy's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. "Everybody knows Miss Mabel," he said. "She runs the laundry over on the east end of Main, the building with the blue door." Jonas thanked him and went to find it. He stood outside the building with the blue door for a moment before going in. He was not a man who got nervous often, but something about this particular errand sat differently in him than anything he had done before. He had a dead man's words in his pocket, a message meant for a woman he had never met, from a father she had lost, filtered through the handwriting of a third man who was also now dead. It was a heavy thing to carry. He took a breath and pushed the door open. The inside of the laundry was steamy and warm, smelling powerfully of lye soap and clean wet cotton, and there were 2 large wooden washtubs against the back wall with a mangle press beside them and ropes strung across the room where linens hung. A woman was working at the far tub with her back to him, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her dark hair pinned up and slightly escaping in the warmth. She was not tall, but she moved with the efficiency of someone who had been doing physical work their whole life and had made a kind of grace out of it. "I will be with you in a moment," she said without turning around. "Take your time," Jonas said. Something in his voice made her pause. She turned around and Jonas Lockhart got his first look at Mabel Norris. She was 24 years old, with dark eyes that were sharp and direct, and a face that was pretty in the unadorned way of a woman who spent no time thinking about whether she was pretty. There was a smear of soap on her left forearm that she had not noticed. Her expression was politely inquiring and held a kind of careful reserve behind it, the expression of a woman who had learned to measure strangers before deciding how much of herself to give them. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jonas removed his hat. "My name is Jonas Lockhart. I'm looking for Mabel Norris." "You found her," she said, drying her hands on a cloth at her waist. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew the letter. "I was given this by a man named Chester Albright. He asked me to bring it to you personally before he died. It concerns your father, Thomas Norris." The cloth stopped moving in her hands. Her face went very still in the way a face goes still when a person is marshaling themselves against something they did not know was coming. "Chester Albright," she repeated. "I did not know Chester was ill." "He was not ill," Jonas said carefully. "He had an accident. I found him and I stayed with him and he gave me the letter and I rode down from Abilene to bring it to you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the letter. She walked toward him and took it from his hand with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knows that some moments cannot be rushed and some things, once opened, change everything. "Will you sit down?" she said. It was not quite a question. She gestured toward a plain wooden chair near the door, and she sat down on a stool near the washtub, and she broke the old wax seal and unfolded the letter. Jonas sat. He watched the window. He gave her the privacy of not watching her face. He heard the sound of the paper. He heard her breathing. He heard, after a minute or two, a small involuntary sound that might have been the beginning of something she stopped before it could grow. He waited. After a long while she folded the letter back along its old creases and held it in both hands in her lap. "He said he was proud of me," she said quietly. "My father. He said he should have told me every single day, and he was sorry that he did not. He said I was the best thing he had ever done and that he knew I would be fine without him because I had always been the strongest one." She paused. "He said he loved me." Jonas said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. "He never said that," Mabel said. "Not once that I can remember, not in words. He showed it in other ways. He was a hard man, but he was not a cold one. I always knew that, but to hear the words." She stopped again. She looked down at her hands. "Thank you for bringing this to me. You rode 300 miles. He asked me to," Jonas said. "That does not mean you had to do it." "No," Jonas agreed. "It does not." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something behind the careful reserve shifted slightly. Not much, just slightly. The way a door shifts when a latch is lifted. "You must be exhausted," she said, "and hungry. There is a boarding house 2 doors down from the general store. Mrs. Hennessy runs it. Tell her I sent you and she will give you a fair rate." She paused. "And if you are willing, Mr. Lockhart, I would like to hear about Chester, about the end, if it was peaceful." "It was as peaceful as I could make it," Jonas said. She nodded, and the way she nodded told him that answer was good enough. He went to Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house and got a room and a bath, and ate the first full meal he had eaten in nearly a week, sitting at a long table with 4 other boarders who talked among themselves and left him alone. He slept for 11 hours straight and woke to the sound of a rooster and the smell of frying salt pork from somewhere below. He had told himself on the road south that once he delivered the letter, his obligation was complete. He had told himself he would rest a day and then ride back north, perhaps toward Dodge City, where there was always work on the cattle drives coming up in the summer season. He had a life that moved, and he had learned to live inside that movement the way some men live inside houses. It was comfortable to him in its own way. But over breakfast, eating biscuits and pork at Mrs. Hennessy's table, and listening to the town come alive outside the window, he found himself thinking about Mabel Norris's face when she had held that letter. He found himself thinking about the way she had said those words. "He said he loved me," with the quiet devastation of someone receiving something they had waited years for and were now receiving too late. He found himself thinking that he had no particular reason to leave today or tomorrow. He had the time. Cooper needed the rest. And the town seemed decent enough. He told himself these were practical considerations. He went to the general store to buy a new pair of work gloves because his old ones had worn through at the palms on the long ride. The store was busy with morning trade, and he spent some time looking at the goods and listening to the commerce around him, the sound of a working town going about its business. On his way out, he very nearly walked into Mabel Norris on the boardwalk. She was carrying a basket of wrapped laundry, and he stepped aside just in time, and they stood on the wooden boards in the morning light looking at each other with the slight awkwardness of people who know each other only from an unusual and intimate circumstance. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, "you are still here." "I am," he said. "My horse needed rest." She considered him. The morning light was kind to her, catching the dark of her hair and the directness of her eyes. "I am delivering these to Mrs. Calloway at the hotel. Walk with me if you like." He fell into step beside her. The street was busy, and people greeted Mabel as they passed with the easy familiarity of a town that knew one of its own. She introduced him to no one but did not ignore him either. She walked with purpose, the basket balanced on her hip, and she talked as she walked, not to fill silence, but because she had decided something and was acting on it. "Chester Albright was a good man," she said. "He and my father met during the war. They were on opposite sides, and they each saved the other's life in different circumstances. And after the war, they decided that was a strong enough basis for friendship, regardless of what side of the line they had stood on. My father said there was a kind of clarity in that, knowing a man had chosen your life over his enemy's ideology." "Your father fought for the Union?" Jonas asked. "He did. He came down from Indiana originally. He settled here after the war because he wanted open land and a place to start clean." She paused. "He was not the sentimental kind, but he loved this place fiercely." "And Chester fought for the Confederacy?" "He did. He was from Georgia, but as I said, they made their peace." She glanced at him sideways. "Where are you from, Mr. Lockhart?" "Missouri originally," Jonas said. "I have not lived there since I was 17. "Whereabouts in Missouri?" "A town called Laclede." "You would not know it." "I would not," she agreed pleasantly. "What took you away from it at 17? He was quiet for a moment. "My father's farm went under the year after the war. There was nothing to stay for and a great deal of land to the west that everyone said was the making of a man if you were willing to work it. I was willing." She nodded. She stopped at the hotel and delivered the laundry to a woman in a white apron who counted the items against a list and handed Mabel coins in return. And then Mabel tucked the empty basket under her arm, and they stood at the corner of Main Street in the mid-morning light. "Thank you again for bringing the letter," she said. "I mean that sincerely. It was a very long way to come for a stranger's errand." "He was not quite a stranger by the time I made the promise," Jonas said. "We had a whole afternoon and evening together. A man does not stay a stranger through all of that." Something in her expression softened then, just slightly. "No," she said, "I suppose he does not." She went back to her laundry, and Jonas went to the livery to check on Cooper. And he spent the afternoon doing small, useful things around town, getting the feel of it, the way he always got the feel of a new place by just moving through it without agenda. Calhoun Creek in the spring of 1874 was a town that had survived enough to be cautiously hopeful about its future. The cattle business kept it breathing, and the farms in the surrounding area brought in enough trade to keep the general store stocked. There was a school that held classes for the children of the town, and the nearby ranches 4 days a week, taught by a young man named Prescott who had studied in St. Louis and come west for reasons he did not share publicly. There was a church with a minister named Caldwell who was serious about his religion but not severe about it, which made him well liked. And there was the laundry with the blue door, which was Mabel Norris's, and which everyone in town agreed was a better business than it had any right to be given that she ran it entirely alone. Jonas learned most of this in the first 2 days simply by sitting in the one saloon that Calhoun Creek possessed, which was called the Dusty Boot, and was exactly what it sounds like, and listening to the men around him talk about their town, the way men always talk about their towns when someone new is listening. On his 3rd morning in Calhoun Creek, he went to the laundry. He pushed open the blue door, and Mabel looked up from the mangle press with an expression that was surprised but not displeased. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, "you are still here." "You keep saying that," he said. "You keep still being here," she replied, and there was the faintest edge of humor in it. He took off his hat and looked around the room, at the washtubs and the ropes of drying laundry and the mangle press and the single small stove in the corner that kept the room warm enough to work in. "I thought you might have a use for an extra pair of hands," he said. "I have nothing pressing, and you look like you have more work than one person can comfortably manage." She regarded him with a steady, measuring look. "Do you know anything about laundry?" "I know how to follow instructions," he said. "And I am stronger than I look." "You look quite strong, Mr. Lockhart," she said, and then seemed to decide she had said too much and looked back at the press. "You can fill the water barrels from the pump out back if you like. That is always the thing I spend most of my morning on, and it slows everything else down." He filled the water barrels. He carried them in 2 at a time, the pump handle squealing in the cool morning air. He brought in a load of firewood from the stack behind the building and restacked it closer to the stove the way she needed it. He did not ask questions, but did whatever she pointed him toward. And by mid-morning the laundry was steaming, and Mabel had progressed further in her work than she usually managed before noon. She made coffee on the small stove and poured 2 cups, and they sat for a few minutes on the plain chairs near the door with the steam rising around them and the sound of the town outside. And it was a comfortable silence in the way that silences are comfortable when 2 people have settled into the same rhythm. "You do not have to keep helping me," she said. "I know that," he said. "Why are you still in Calhoun Creek?" she asked. Not accusingly, genuinely, he looked at his coffee cup. He was an honest man by nature, and he had learned that the surest way to complicate things was to be dishonest with yourself first. "Because I am not in a hurry to leave," he said. "Because this town seems decent and my horse is rested and the work on the drives does not start again until later in the season." He paused. "And because I would like to know more about you, Mabel Norris, if you are willing." She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him carefully, and he could see her thinking. Not about whether she wanted to answer, but about whether she wanted to want to. It was a distinction he recognized because he had felt it himself more than once. "You are a traveling man," she said finally. "Cattle drives, you said." "Yes. Traveling men make poor investments," she said. It was not bitter, it was practical. "I have heard that," he said. "My mother waited years for a man who told her he would settle down," she said, and her voice was level, the voice of someone who has made peace with a fact without fully making peace with the wound it left. "My father was not that man. He loved this land and he loved his family, but he could not stop moving through the country until he was too old to move anymore. And even then he was restless." "Is that why he never said what he felt?" Jonas asked. "Because he was always thinking about the next thing." She looked at him sharply, then thoughtfully. "That is a perceptive question," she said. "I had a lot of time to think on the ride down," he said. "About what Chester told me, about the kind of man he described." "What did Chester say about him?" she asked. And so Jonas told her what Chester had said in those last hours, the things that had not made it into the letter. How Thomas Norris had spoken of his daughter with a pride so intense it embarrassed him. Because Thomas was a man who did not think highly of sentimentality, and could not reconcile how deeply he felt about his child with his own self-image. How he had gone to Chester with the letter not because he was dying, but because the consumption had taken his voice, and he had realized, mutely and suddenly, that he had run out of time to say things in person. How Chester had told him that it was not too late to write it, and Thomas had shaken his head and then nodded and then shaken his head again. And finally, with great difficulty and much crossing out, had managed to dictate what Chester wrote down. Mabel listened to all of it without speaking. When Jonas finished, she was quiet for a while, looking at her hands. "He was a difficult man to love," she said. "But I loved him. I always knew he loved me back in his way." The letter just made it. She stopped. "Solid," she said at last. "It made it solid, like something I had always believed but could not touch, and now I can touch it." Jonas nodded. "Thank you," she said again, and this time it carried a weight that it had not carried before, because she was not thanking him for the delivery. She was thanking him for the story, for the human parts that the letter could not contain. He understood then why Chester had insisted on a personal delivery. Chester had known that the letter alone was not enough. Chester had known that someone needed to be there to give the living context to the written words, and that whoever that someone was would have to be willing to sit with a woman's grief and her gratitude and not flinch from either. He had not flinched. They talked for another half-hour that morning, about nothing in particular, about the town and the spring weather and the fact that Mabel's laundry business had been started with $12 she had saved over 2 years from taking in mending work, and how she had bought the building for $60 from a man who was moving to California and needed the money fast. She was clearly proud of this. She should have been. In 1874, A woman running her own business in a frontier town without a husband or father to act as her representative was a thing that required not just capability but a particular kind of spine, and Mabel Norris had clearly possessed that spine since before she needed it. Over the days that followed, a rhythm developed. Jonas came in the mornings to help with the heavy work, the water carrying and the wood, the things that were hard for one person to manage without losing half the day. In return, Mabel fed him lunch, which she made on the small stove with whatever she had, beans and salt pork most days, sometimes cornbread, once a rabbit stew that a neighboring farmer had brought her in trade for laundering his shirts. The food was plain and good, and she made it without fuss. In the afternoons, Jonas worked where he could find work in town. He helped a man named Burley fix a section of fence on his property at the edge of town for $1.50. He spent 2 days helping the livery operator, a heavy-set man named Cruz, repair the roof of the stable that had partially caved in under the weight of the winter's last snow. Cruz was a quiet man of Mexican descent who had been in Calhoun Creek longer than most of the current residents and who had a dry and careful sense of humor that Jonas liked. Cruz watched Jonas work with the careful attention of a man who is making assessments. On the afternoon of the second day, he said, without looking up from the roofing timber he was shaping, "You are still here because of the Norris woman." It was not a question. Jonas kept working. "Partly," he said. "She is a good woman," Cruz said. "Smart, does not suffer fools, works hard. Her father was a hard man but not a bad one." He paused. "She has not had an easy time. After he died, she had to settle his debts from his estate before she could clear the title on the laundry building. There were those who tried to take advantage of a woman settling accounts alone." "What happened to them?" Jonas asked. Cruz's expression was briefly satisfied. "She had better lawyers than they expected," he said, "and she could read contracts better than most of the men she dealt with. She came out with the building and not much else, but she came out." Jonas thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. That evening he went to the boarding house for supper and afterward sat on the front porch watching the street as the town settled into its evening rhythms, the lamps being lit, the saloon growing louder, the families moving inside. He had a small glass of whiskey he had poured himself from the bottle Mrs. Hennessy kept for boarders, and he thought about the question of what he was doing in Calhoun Creek. He was a practical man, and he tried to think practically. He had a job, or at least the prospect of one, on the cattle drives north. He had no property, no land, nothing that anchored him anywhere. He had spent 9 years moving across this country and had not considered staying in any particular part of it because no particular part of it had given him reason to. He thought about Mabel Norris sitting on the stool in her steamy laundry, holding her dead father's letter in both hands and saying the words, "He said he loved me," with that particular quiet devastation. He thought about the way she walked, purposeful and steady. He thought about the sharpness of her mind, the way she talked about her business and the town. He thought about her eyes, which were dark and direct, and held a warmth behind all that reserve that she clearly did not dispense carelessly. He was not a man who fell in love easily. He had been fond of women before, and they of him, but he had always moved on before anything could grow into something permanent, partly from habit and partly because he had never had a strong enough reason to stop. He had told himself the moving was the point of his life. He was not sure, sitting on Mrs. Hennessy's porch in the spring evening with the smell of Calhoun Creek's wood smoke in the air, that he still believed that. He stayed. Sunday came and he walked to the church because Mabel was there, and because it gave him a reason to see her outside of the laundry, and also because he had not attended a church service in some time and felt dimly that it might do him good. He sat 2 rows behind her and watched her sing the hymns in a clear, unself-conscious voice, and Minister Caldwell spoke about the cost of pride and the relief of honesty, and Jonas thought the sermon was addressed to him personally. After the service, Mabel was stopped by several women on the steps who wanted to discuss a social matter of some kind, and Jonas waited at the edge of the yard under a young cottonwood tree until she was free. When she came toward him, she was smiling, a real one, not her polite public smile, but the one that reached her eyes, and he thought it was a remarkable thing. "You were in church," she said. "I was," he said. "I did not take you for the church-going kind," she said. "I am the occasional kind," he said. "I have more conversations with God on horseback than in buildings, but I respect the buildings." She laughed at that. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a good one, unguarded and genuine. They walked together after church through the quieter streets of the town Sunday morning, when the businesses were closed, and the sound of the place was different, softer, more domestic. She told him about growing up in Calhoun Creek, the years when it was smaller and harder, and the drought of 1868 that had nearly broken the town entirely. She told him about the winter she was 16 when the fever went through and took 3 families, and how the community had pulled together in the aftermath in the way that communities do when they have no choice, with a simplicity and directness that is only available in crisis. She told him about starting her business at 21, the year after her father's health began to decline, and she realized she could not depend on his ability to work the small farm he kept at the edge of town. She had sold the farm after he died, cleared his debts, and kept the laundry. She did not say these things with self-pity. She said them with the equanimity of someone who had processed their difficulties through the sheer necessity of managing them. "Did you ever consider leaving?" Jonas asked. "Going somewhere else?" "Where would I go?" she said, and it was a real question, not a dismissive one. "This is my town. I know these people. I have built something here. It is not grand, but it is mine." She looked at him. "You find that strange, perhaps. For someone like you, staying in one place seems to be the thing that does not make sense." "I used to think that," he said. She looked at him sideways. And now, he said, "I am finding that the things I used to be sure of are rearranging themselves somewhat." She did not answer that directly. But she did not look away either, and they walked on together through the quiet Sunday town, and the space between them felt different than it had a week ago. Smaller, more charged. 2 weeks became 3. Jonas took on more regular work at the livery alongside Cruz, who was glad enough of reliable help that he offered a fair wage without being asked. Jonas was good with horses, which was perhaps the most practical skill a man could have in this part of the world in 1874, and Cruz let him take on the training work, the young horses that needed handling and the older ones that had picked up bad habits. Jonas had a patience with horses that he did not always have with people, a quiet, consistent presence that animals responded to in a way that was almost immediate. Mabel came to watch him work with a young bay filly one afternoon. She leaned on the fence of the small training yard and watched him move with the horse in the unhurried, circling way that good horsemen move, and she was quiet and attentive, and when he was done and came to lean on the fence beside her, she said, "You are very good at that." "It is mostly just listening," he said. "To the horse, to the situation," he said. "Most people want to impose what they want on the thing in front of them. With horses and most other situations, it works better to pay attention to what is actually there and go from there." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You are a philosopher, Mr. Lockhart." "Jonas," he said. He had been wanting to say that for some time. A pause. "Jonas," she said, and something in the word felt like a step taken, like a door fully opened. He turned to look at her then, directly, the way he had learned not to look at her too directly because it tended to make him forget what he had been saying. She was looking back at him with that careful, measuring gaze, but underneath it now was something that was not reserve. It was attention, a very specific, very deliberate attention. "Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was not answering a question. He was quiet for a moment. The bay filly moved peacefully in the training yard behind him, and the late afternoon light came down golden over the rooflines of Calhoun Creek, and it smelled like horses and spring grass and the clean wood of the new building going up down the street. "I find that I am not particularly interested in leaving," he said. She considered this for what felt like a long time. "That is a modest way to put it," she said. "I have been trying to be careful," he said. "I am aware of what you said." About traveling men. I said they make poor investments, she said. Yes. I have been revising that position somewhat, she said. She said it quietly and almost carefully, as though the words were a small bet she was making with a thing she was not sure she could afford to lose. Not all traveling men travel because they do not want to stop. Some of them travel because they have not yet found a reason. That is an accurate distinction, he said. Have you found a reason, she asked. Direct. She was always direct when it mattered. I believe I have, he said, just as directly. If the reason is willing. She did not smile in the pretty, automatic way that women sometimes smile when men say things meant to please. She looked at him seriously and honestly, the way she looked at everything, and after a moment she said, I am not an easy woman, Jonas. I have spent 3 years building something that is mine, and I will not diminish it for anyone. I am particular about my independence. I have opinions and I state them. I expect to be treated as an equal in practical matters. These things do not change. I would not want them to, he said. She looked at him as though assessing whether he meant that. Most men say that, she said. Most men have not spent 3 weeks carrying your water barrels and following your instructions without complaint, he said. She laughed again. The good laugh, the unguarded one. And then she looked at him and something in her face shifted entirely, all the reserve dropping away for a moment like a curtain pulled back, and he could see the full warmth of her, the deep and careful feeling she had been keeping at arm's length, and it nearly took his breath. No, she said, they have not. He reached out and she allowed it, and he took her hand in both of his, her laundry-roughened, capable hand, and held it with the care you give to something you are not sure yet belongs to you, but that you want very badly to deserve. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you are willing. I am willing, she said, and it was the simplest and most significant thing he had ever heard. He walked her home that evening, to the small house 2 streets back from Maine that she rented, with a porch that had a good chair on it and a kitchen window that faced east to catch the morning light. She had planted things along the edge of the porch in tin cans and old crocks, herbs and one small rose bush that was just beginning to leaf. He noticed all of it. He noticed the way she unlocked her door with the key she kept in her coat pocket and the way she turned back to look at him from the threshold. Good night, Jonas, she said. Good night, Mabel, he said. He walked back through the evening town feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, and it took him all the way back to Mrs. Hennessy's porch before he could name it. It was simple, and it was large, and it was the feeling of a man who has been traveling for a very long time and has suddenly recognized with perfect clarity that he is home. The courtship that followed was conducted with the serious attentiveness of 2 people who were both old enough to know what they wanted and honest enough to know that getting it required care. Jonas was not the type for grand romantic speeches, but he was the type for consistent, considered action, and Mabel, it turned out, responded to that far more powerfully than she would have responded to speeches. He brought her things that were useful. Good oil for the laundry stove's hinges, which had been squealing. A proper mangle wrench when the old one cracked. He fixed the catch on her back gate that had been sticking since winter. He did these things not to obligate her, but because they needed doing and he was there, and had the means. She let him in gradually, in the way that Mabel Norris let anyone in, which was to say not gradually at all once she had decided to. When she decided a thing, she decided it, and what she had decided was that Jonas Lockhart was a man worth trusting, and so she trusted him. She showed him the account books she kept for the laundry, precise columns of income and expense in her clear small handwriting. She showed him the letter from her father, took it out and read parts of it to him, and talked about Thomas Norris in a way she had clearly not been able to talk about him with anyone else, because grief in a small town tends to get absorbed into the communal story and then moves on, and individuals are expected to move on with it. Jonas listened. He was a good listener. He had learned that from Chester Albright's last hours, perhaps, the necessity and value of simply staying present with someone who needed a witness. They took to eating supper together at Mabel's kitchen table on the evenings when he was not needed elsewhere, and she cooked with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Simple food made well, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and talked about everything. They talked about the town and about history and about the state of things in the country generally, because Mabel read the newspaper when she could get one and held informed opinions. They talked about the cattle business and the railroad and what it was doing to the landscape of the West, the way it was bringing people faster than the land could sometimes absorb them. They talked about the injustice of what was happening to the Comanche peoples of the Llano Estacado, the brutal campaign being waged against them that very year by the army, pushing them from the land they had lived on for generations to make room for cattlemen and farmers. Mabel felt strongly about this. Jonas had seen enough of the frontier to understand what she felt. "It is not a thing I can fix," she said one evening, her hands flat on the table. "But it matters that we see it clearly, that we name it for what it is." "Dispossession," he said. "Yes," she said, dressed up as progress and civilization, but dispossession. She looked at him steadily. "My father was among the beneficiaries of it. He knew it. I think it was one of the things he could not reconcile in himself." "A lot of the men who came out here could not reconcile it," Jonas said. "It did not stop most of them." "No," she said, "it did not." They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, and it was one of those conversations that did not resolve because it could not resolve, because the injustice it addressed was still happening in the world outside the window and would continue happening. But there was a value in sitting with it together, Jonas thought, in not looking away. May turned to June, and with June came the summer heat in earnest, the kind of heat that the Texas panhandle in summer produces with an almost aggressive thoroughness. A wide blue sky pressed down by a sun that seemed larger than it had any right to be, the land bleached pale beneath it. The laundry work was harder in the heat, and Mabel worked longer hours to compensate, starting before dawn when it was still cool and working through the morning. Jonas came earlier to help. Cruz had promoted him to something like a full partner in the livery, not official but effective, and Jonas was earning a steady wage for the first time in years that was not tied to the seasonal drift of cattle drive work. He found this pleasing in a way he had not expected, the steadiness of it, the way the town knew his name and nodded at him on the street. He realized with some wonder, becoming a resident of Calhoun Creek. One evening in the second week of June, Jonas went a call on Mabel and found her sitting on her porch in the good chair with her face turned toward the last of the evening light, and she looked, for just a moment before she knew he was there, like a woman carrying something heavy. He had learned her face well enough by now to read the small differences in it, and this was not her ordinary tiredness. This was something else. He sat down on the porch steps and looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She glanced at him, and then she did tell him. A man named Whitfield, who owned a large amount of property on the east end of town, had approached her that afternoon with an offer to buy her building. The offer was below market value, and the conversation had carried a tone that she did not like. Whitfield had a history, she explained, of acquiring properties in Calhoun Creek in ways that were legal but not quite fair, and she had heard that he had recently decided that the east end of Main Street was going to be valuable once the railroad spur being planned for the county seat was built, and that he intended to own as much of it as he could before that happened. He implied, Mabel said, her voice very controlled, that a woman running a laundry alone was not a sensible investment of a building on a street that was about to become valuable. He suggested I would do better to sell now and move the business to a less advantageous location before the market made that decision for me. "Did he threaten you directly?" Jonas asked. "Not directly," she said. "Men like Whitfield do not threaten directly. They suggest. They imply. They let the threat inhabit the conversation without ever quite taking shape." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was not interested in selling and that he was welcome to take the matter up with my lawyer in Amarillo," she said. who does exist, by the way, though I have not needed to contact him in some time. What do you need from me? Jonas asked. She looked at him for a moment. I do not know yet, she said. I needed to tell someone who would understand why it matters. The building is not just property to me. I know, he said. It is your independence. It is the thing you built. Yes, she said. He reached up from the step and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she let her fingers close around his. They sat like that while the evening came down around them and the first stars appeared over the Panhandle sky, enormous and close in that particular way the Texas sky had, as though someone had removed all the distances. We will deal with Whitfield, Jonas said. We, she repeated. If you are willing, he said. She looked at the stars. She looked at their joined hands. I am finding, she said, that I am more willing about most things than I expected to be. He looked up at her and she looked down at him, and the moment between them was very quiet and very full. He said, Mabel. She said, Jonas. And then he stood up from the step and she stood from the chair, and he kissed her there on the porch in the early dark, the first time, careful and certain. And she kissed him back with a directness that was entirely consistent with everything else about her. And afterward they stood forehead to forehead for a moment in the summer dark, and he could feel her breathing and she could feel his. That was a long time coming, she said. I was being careful, he said. You have been very careful, she said. You made it clear that care was warranted, he said. It was, she said, but perhaps sufficient care has been taken. He laughed and she laughed, and they went inside and sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked until quite late. And when he finally walked back to Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, it was past 11 and the town was fully dark and quiet, and he was grinning in the way that men grin when no one is watching. The situation with Whitfield resolved itself over the following week in a manner that was largely bloodless, which was how Jonas had hoped it would go. He spoke to Cruz, who knew everyone in Calhoun Creek and had a long memory for how people behaved, and Cruz connected him with two other business owners on the east end of Maine who had received similar visits from Whitfield and were collectively unhappy about it. They organized. They went together, the three of them, to speak to the town's local judge, a careful man named Beaumont who had a reputation for patience but not for being manipulated, and they laid out the pattern of Whitfield's approaches. Beaumont listened. He made no promises, but he asked questions that suggested he understood what was happening. Within the week, Whitfield received a visit from Beaumont's clerk with a document strongly suggesting that any further informal business conversations of the type he had been conducting might be subject to closer legal scrutiny. Whitfield did not approach Mabel's building again. When Jonas told her, she pressed her lips together and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, You did not have to do that. I know, he said. You did it without making a show of it, she said, without telling me until it was done. I thought you might object to the involvement, he said honestly. I might have, she admitted, but I cannot. She paused. Thank you. The other business owners did most of the work, he said. I just helped organize it. You found the others, she said, and you went with them. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was learning to read, the expression she wore when she was making a decision that was larger than the immediate moment. Jonas, she said. Yes. I am not a woman who changes her mind quickly, she said. But when I do change it, I change it completely, and I have changed my mind about the traveling man question entirely. He waited. I think you are the settling kind, she said. I think you always were. You just needed the right place. I think you may be right, he said. The summer moved on. Jonas moved out of Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house in July and took a proper room above the livery that Cruz offered him, which gave him more independence and a better base for his morning starts with the horses. He and Mabel had supper together most evenings, alternating between her kitchen table and the small restaurant on Main Street that served decent food at fair prices. They went to church on Sundays. They walked in the evenings. They talked. They talked endlessly, it seemed, but it never felt like filling time. It felt like discovery, the ongoing revelation of two people who are genuinely interested in each other in the deep way that makes conversation inexhaustible. She told him things she had not told other people, and he told her things he had not said out loud in years: the texture of his early life in Missouri, his father's quiet defeat after the war, the strange freedom and loneliness of his years on the trail. "Were you ever lonely?" she asked him once. "Yes," he said. "Often. I told myself it was independence. A useful confusion," she said. "Necessary at the time," he said. "Less so now." "Less so now," she agreed softly. In August, a photographer came through Calhoun Creek with a wagon and a portable studio, offering portraits for a reasonable price, and Mabel agreed to have one taken, and she asked Jonas to sit beside her, and he did, and the photograph that resulted was kept on her kitchen shelf and looked at often by both of them when the other was not watching. September brought the first cooling of the air and the smell of change that comes to the plains in autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow, and the light shifted to that lower, longer angle that makes the Panhandle country look like a painting. Jonas had been in Calhoun Creek for nearly 5 months. He had steady work. He had a small savings built up. He had something he had not had in years, which was the feeling that the ground beneath him was solid and intended to stay that way. On a Saturday evening in the first week of October, he put on his clean shirt and his best coat and went to Mabel's house and knocked on the door. When she opened it, she looked at him, looked at the state of his dress, and a smile began at the corner of her mouth. "You look purposeful," she said. "I am," he said. She stepped back and let him in. The kitchen was warm, smelling of supper and wood smoke. She sat at the table and he sat across from her, and he looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who had received a dead man's letter and changed the direction of his life without intending to. And he thought about Chester Albright pressing that paper into his hand in the failing light beside a dry creek bed. And he thought about how strange and how merciful it was that one man's grief could carry something forward to meet another man's hope. "Mabel," he said. "Jonas," she said, watching him. "I came to Calhoun Creek because a dying man asked me to bring you a letter," he said. "I stayed because I could not bring myself to leave. I have spent 5 months understanding why, and I understand it clearly now." He reached into his coat pocket and set a small ring on the table between them, a plain silver band he had asked the silversmith in Amarillo to make for him on a supply run in August, simple and well made. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something that was not sadness. "Chester's letter," she said quietly. "I have thought about it many times. What it cost my father to send those words, even at the end. The things we leave unsaid until the last moment." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I do not want to leave things unsaid, Jonas." "Neither do I," he said. "I love you," she said, simply and directly, the way she said everything that mattered. "I have for some time. I was being careful." "Sufficient care has been taken?" he asked. "More than sufficient," she said, and she was smiling now, the full smile, the real one. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it on her hand for a moment. And then she looked up at him, and her eyes were full, not with grief but with something that was the opposite of grief, the feeling of arrival, of having come through a long road to exactly the right place. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood, and he held her the way he had wanted to hold her since that first afternoon in the steamy laundry, when she had turned around and looked at him with those careful dark eyes. And she held him back without reserve. And the kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit. And outside, the Panhandle autumn was settling over Calhoun Creek in the gentle, cooling dark. They were married in November, on a clear and cold Saturday with a sky so blue it seemed painted. Minister Caldwell performed the ceremony in the church that had become familiar to both of them, and the town of Calhoun Creek turned out in numbers that surprised Jonas, although it should not have. Mabel had been there for years and was known and liked, and the town was, as Jonas had understood from the first days, the kind of place that showed up for its own. Cruz stood with Jonas, wearing a clean suit that he had clearly retrieved from the very back of his closet, and he looked so solemn and pleased that Jonas had to work not to smile at him. Mabel came down the aisle in a dress that was the dark blue of deep water, not a traditional white because she was a practical woman, and a dark blue dress could be worn again, and she looked beautiful in the complete way that some women look beautiful when they are doing precisely what they have chosen to do, with full knowledge and full willingness. She was not a nervous bride. She was a decided one. Jonas watched her come toward him and thought about a letter in a dead man's coat pocket and a 300-mile ride across the Kansas and Texas plains, and thought about how a person can spend years moving across the face of the earth without knowing that all of that movement was, in its own way, a kind of navigation. Finding the right coordinates without knowing that was what you were doing. He thought, briefly and with gratitude, of Chester Albright, who had pressed a letter into his hand with the fierce grip of a dying man who needed to know that something he was carrying would reach its destination. He thought of Thomas Norris, who had loved his daughter with a depth he could not express until he had lost his voice and found, in that loss, a strange, terrible freedom to finally say the thing. He thought of all the words that men carry silently for years and years and what it costs them and the people they love. And then Mabel was beside him, and she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright and steady, and everything else retreated to a comfortable distance. They said their vows in clear voices. Jonas had thought about the words carefully, and when he said them, they were not rote. They were chosen. He promised her partnership and honesty, and the respect she had demanded from the first conversation, and that he had been glad to give. She promised him the same, in her own direct way, with the addition of telling him that she intended to be an excellent wife without sacrificing a single one of her opinions, which made the congregation laugh and Minister Caldwell smile. When it was done, they walked out into the November sunshine together, as husband and wife, and the town of Calhoun Creek congratulated them with a warmth that settled over Jonas like something he had not known he was cold without. The wedding supper was held at the larger of Calhoun Creek's two saloons, the one that had a back room big enough for a proper gathering, and tables were set up, and food was brought, and someone produced a fiddle and a banjo, and the evening became what an evening in a frontier town in 1874 becomes when people decide to celebrate, which is to say something simple and raucous and genuinely joyful. Jonas danced with his wife. He was not a particularly skilled dancer, but he was willing and she was patient, and they managed between them a reasonable approximation of the dancing happening around them. She laughed when he stepped wrong, and he apologized with great seriousness, and she laughed harder. "You are a better horseman than you are a dancer," she said. Significantly, he agreed. "It is all right," she said. "I did not marry you for the dancing." "What did you marry me for?" he asked. She looked up at him with those direct dark eyes in the middle of the fiddle-loud, lamplight-warm room and said, "Because you rode 300 miles to bring a dead man's love to a woman who needed to receive it, and then you stayed." He could not have said anything to improve on that, so he did not try. He simply held her, and they turned slowly in the middle of the dancing, and the evening went on around them. The winter of 1874 and into 1875 settled them into the life they were building together with a thoroughness that pleased Jonas in a way he had not expected. He had been, for 9 years, a man whose life fit in saddlebags. Now he lived in a house. Not a rented room, but a house, a real one, because the month after the wedding Mabel had proposed that they buy the small property 2 doors down from hers that had come available when its owner relocated to Amarillo, and they had done so together, pooling what each of them had managed to save, and Jonas had spent several weeks making it right, fixing the things that needed fixing and improving what could be improved. He brought Cruz in to help with the heavier carpentry work, and Cruz brought his son, a quiet young man of 19 named Ernesto who had his father's steady manner and a gift for finish work. Together the 4 of them, because Mabel worked alongside them without apology, transformed a serviceable house into a genuinely comfortable home. Mabel kept the laundry. That was never in question. She expanded it slightly in the spring of 1875, taking on a helper, a young woman named Addie whose family had recently come to Calhoun Creek from East Texas, 14 years old and quick to learn and in need of the income. Mabel taught her carefully and paid her fairly, and the business grew. Jonas worked the livery. Cruz had made the partnership official in the winter, drawing up a simple agreement that split the business between them, because Cruz was getting older and wanted someone to carry more of the daily weight. Jonas was glad to carry it. He expanded the training side of things, and word got around to the ranches outside town that the Lockhart and Cruz livery was the place to take a difficult horse, and they were never short of work. Spring came back with its particular sweetness after the cold months, and with it came the news that Mabel was expecting, which she delivered to Jonas one morning over breakfast with her characteristic directness and without ceremony. She simply said, "I believe we are going to have a child, Jonas, sometime in the fall if my reckoning is right." He put down his coffee cup. He looked at her. He felt something enormous and simple rise up in him the way a tide rises quietly and completely. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am terrified and I am happy," she said. "Both things at the same time." "That sounds right," he said. He reached across the table and took her hands, and they sat in the morning kitchen light for a while, not saying anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The news moved through Calhoun Creek in the way that news moves through small towns, not quickly but thoroughly. Cruz clapped Jonas on the shoulder and said nothing further, which from Cruz was a great deal. Mrs. Hennessy called it wonderful news. Minister Caldwell offered a quiet congratulations. Addie, who had become very fond of Mabel in the way that young women become fond of women they respect and learn from, made no secret of her delight. Mabel worked through the summer as she always worked, efficiently and without complaint, though she let Jonas and Addie take on more of the heavy lifting as the months progressed, and she adapted her expectations of herself with the same practical intelligence she brought to every other problem. She read what she could find on the subject, which in a frontier town in 1875 was not extensive, and she asked the town's doctor, a quiet man named Haverford who had studied in Philadelphia, her questions directly and without embarrassment. The child was born in early October 1875, a Saturday, the morning of a day that was cool and clear. Jonas was with her, because she had told him she wanted him there and he had not hesitated. Haverford delivered the baby with the calm efficiency of a trained man, and Mabel labored with her characteristic determination, focused and unfrightened even when it was hard. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and loud and had, Haverford noted professionally, an excellent set of lungs. Jonas held him for the first time in the afternoon light while Mabel rested, this small, astonishing person who was theirs, and he sat beside the bed in the chair and held the baby and thought about Chester Albright. He thought about Thomas Norris. He thought about all the lives that had intersected and led to this moment. A boy born in a frontier town in the Texas Panhandle, to a woman who ran a laundry and a man who had been a drifter until he was not, and how the whole chain of it stretched back to a dying man's hand pressing a letter into his palm on a Kansas afternoon. "What shall we call him?" Mabel asked from the bed. Her voice was tired but whole. "What do you want?" Jonas asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Chester," she said, "if you think it is right." He looked at the baby and thought about the man who had not been quite a stranger by the time he had made the promise, and he felt the rightness of it in a way that settled simply and completely. "Chester Thomas Lockhart," he said. "Chester Thomas," Mabel agreed. "For both of them." Cruz and Ernesto came to visit with a crib they had made, unannounced, setting it down in the front room with the contained satisfaction of men who have made something good. Cruz looked at the baby for a long time without speaking and then said, "He has your eyes, Mabel," and then looked at Jonas and added, "and your stubbornness," and walked out before either of them could respond. Addie came and held the baby and cried, which she apologized for, and which Mabel told her not to apologize for at all. Mrs. Hennessy brought a pie. The town, in its small and personal and particular ways, held them. The years that followed were good years. Not without difficulty, because no years are without difficulty. And the Texas Panhandle in the late 1870s was a place of ongoing uncertainty, of drought years and hard winters, and the rumbling of the cattle market, and the constant evolution of a region that was still becoming what it would be. But the Lockhart household on the good street in Calhoun Creek was, in all the ways that counted, a flourishing place. Chester grew into a serious and observant boy with his mother's eyes and his father's patience. And by the time he was 3, he was accompanying Jonas to the livery, and regarding the horses with an attention that suggested he had inherited Jonas's particular gift with them. Mabel watched this with the quiet pleasure of a woman watching something she loves multiply itself. In 1878, the railroad spur that everyone had been discussing for 4 years finally came through, and the value of Calhoun Creek's Main Street property increased substantially. Whitfield had given up his ambitions in the area some years before and moved to Amarillo, and the laundry building with the blue door remained Mabel's, and its value was now considerable, and she was not unaware of the satisfaction this gave her. The railroad brought more people and more commerce, and the livery expanded further to handle the increased traffic. Jonas took on 2 more hands, and Ernesto Cruz, who had become as skilled as his father, became a full partner. Cruz the elder retired with a ceremony that amounted to Jonas and Mabel bringing a supper to his house and sitting with him for the whole evening while he told stories about Calhoun Creek before any of them had come there, which was a history worth knowing. In 1879, Mabel told Jonas again over breakfast that they were expecting. "Again with the breakfast," he said. "It is the time of day when I have processed things sufficiently to speak about them," she said. He stood up and went around the table and kissed her on the top of her head, and then crouched down and took her face in his hands and kissed her properly. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, smiling. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1879 on a day so hot that even the bees seemed tired. She was named Ruth, for no one in particular, but because Mabel had always loved the name for its qualities of loyalty and tenacity. And she was from her first day a person of vivid and unmistakable temperament, louder than her brother, more insistent, more inclined to make her requirements known. Chester, who was nearly 4, regarded his new sister with the careful wariness of a child confronting something genuinely unpredictable, and then settled into an older sibling protectiveness that would define them for the rest of their lives. Jonas and Mabel lay awake one night in the late summer of 1879, with Ruth finally asleep in the crib in the next room, and the sound of Chester breathing steadily in his small room down the hall. And the Panhandle night was full of stars outside the window, that enormous close sky that Jonas had come to love with a depth that still surprised him sometimes. "Do you remember," Mabel said in the dark, "the day I tried to explain to you why traveling men made poor investments?" "I remember," he said. "I was right," she said. In general, he agreed. "You were the exception," she said. "You revised your assessment," he reminded her. "I revised it," she said, "because the evidence required it." A pause. "Jonas, Mabel, Chester Albright asked you to deliver a letter," she said, "and you rode 300 miles to do it." "He asked me specifically," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you did it." "A man asked me to," he said. "He was dying, there was no one else." "That is not entirely the reason you did it," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the dark. "No," he said, "it is not. I did it because it seemed like the most important thing I could do, because some things matter more than the inconvenience of doing them, because a letter from a dying man deserved to reach the person it was meant for, regardless of the distance." "And then you stayed," she said. "And then I stayed," he said. She found his hand in the dark and held it. He turned onto his side and she was already looking at him, her dark eyes finding his in the starlight that came through the curtain. And she was the same woman she had been on the first day, direct and careful and warm and entirely herself. And she was also more than that woman now, layered with the years they had spent together, and he loved her with a completeness that occasionally astonished him. "I am glad Chester found you," she said. "So am I," he said. Though he would say the credit goes to Thomas, who dictated the letter. "And Thomas would say the credit goes to Chester, who wrote it," she said. "And Chester would say the credit goes to the broken leg," Jonas said. She laughed softly in the dark. "A fortuitous broken leg," she said. "The most fortuitous broken leg in the history of Kansas," he agreed. She pressed herself close to him, and he held her in the warm, dark room with the sound of their children sleeping around them and the panhandle sky burning with stars outside. And the life they had built together settled over them like something earned and solid and right. In the years that followed, the Lockhart family became one of the fixtures of Calhoun Creek in the way that families become fixtures when they work with integrity and engage with genuine care. Jonas and Cruz's livery was the best-regarded stable operation in 3 counties. Mabel's laundry expanded twice more, and she eventually trained Addie well enough to bring her in as a managing partner, which meant the business was running smoothly with or without Mabel's daily presence, which gave her time she used to teach herself bookkeeping at a more advanced level, and to sit on the committee that raised money for the new schoolhouse in 1881. Chester Thomas Lockhart grew into a tall, quiet boy who loved horses the way his father did, and who had, in addition, an aptitude for the mathematics that his school teacher recognized early and encouraged specifically. By the time he was 12, he could calculate anything Mabel needed for the business accounts in his head faster than she could work it out on paper. Ruth Lockhart grew into a force of nature. She was clever and stubborn and funny, and deeply fond of her brother in the way of someone who finds a reliable counterbalance to their own nature. And she was the kind of child who did not accept arbitrary authority, and who asked, why, with a persistence that her parents found simultaneously exhausting and deeply gratifying. Jonas watched his children with a wonder that did not diminish with familiarity. He watched Mabel with a love that had deepened past the point where he could describe it easily, the way water deepens in a well the longer it goes undisturbed. One evening in the summer of 1882, Jonas came home from the livery to find Mabel sitting on the porch in the good chair, the evening light catching her face in the way it had on the first day he had recognized that he was not going to leave, and she was holding a piece of paper. He sat down on the steps, his old position. "What is that?" She held it out. It was a letter from the lawyer in Amarillo, informing her that the estate of one Henry Calloway, a distant relative of whom Mabel had been barely aware, had left her a modest sum of money, enough to be meaningful but not enough to be life-changing. "What will you do with it?" Jonas asked. She looked at the letter. She looked at the street, at Calhoun Creek's main street, which had grown and changed, and was now twice the place it had been when Jonas had ridden into it for the first time on a tired roan horse with a letter in his coat pocket. "I would like to expand the laundry one more time," she said, "and I would like to set some aside for Chester's schooling beyond what the town offers. There is a school in Amarillo that he should attend," she paused, "and I would like to buy the empty lot beside the house." "What will you put on it?" Jonas asked. "A garden," she said, "a real one, with the rosebush finally in the ground where it can grow." She looked at him. "What do you think?" "I think the rosebush deserves to be in the ground," he said. She smiled. "So do I." He climbed the steps and sat on the arm of her chair, and she leaned against him, and they looked at the street together, at the town they had made their life in, and it was a good and ordinary evening. He put his arm around her, and she settled against him, and he thought about Chester Albright on his last night, lying by the dry creek with the April sky above him, pressing a letter into the hands of a stranger, and asking for something that required trust in the goodness of someone he did not know. He thought about Thomas Norris finding, at the end of his life, that the most important thing was a simple thing, the 3 words he had not managed to say in all the years he had them to say. He thought about the letter traveling south in his coat pocket all those miles, across the grass country and through the river mud, and over the bleached spring plain, carrying that plain and necessary love toward the woman who needed to receive it. He thought about walking into a laundry with a blue door and seeing a woman turn around, and about everything that had followed from that single moment, the accumulating weight of all those days and choices and conversations, and the children sleeping in the house behind him, and this woman leaning against him on the porch in the summer evening. Chester Albright had given him a name in a letter from a dying man. He had ridden 300 miles to find her and say what the letter couldn't. What the letter couldn't say was the thing that came after it, the story that needed a living person to carry it, the presence, the staying, the thing that love actually is when it moves beyond words and becomes the texture of 2 lives fitted together in an ordinary and irreplaceable way. He had stayed, and everything from that single act of staying had grown. "Jonas," Mabel said against his shoulder. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, simply. As she said everything that mattered, he pressed his lips to her hair. "I know," he said, "I love you." The Panhandle evening settled around them, soft and star-ready, and the town moved through its evening business around them, and the children were inside and safe, and the horses were stabled, and the business was good, and the rosebush was going in the ground in the spring. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.